Hey guys, good evening, and welcome back to Lullaby Historian. Tonight we begin with something very strange. The Crucible of the Continent, a saga of American destiny. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. The Crucible of the Continent, a saga of American destiny. The year was 1770. New Haven, Massachusetts, was a town defined by its water. Not the placid, deep blue of the open ocean, but the muddy, restless churn of the harbor, where the old world anchored its power and the new world sought its freedom. The air was a potent, layered concoction. The sharp salinity of the tide, the oily stink of boiling tar used to caulk seams, the sweet, heavy scent of freshly cut white pine, and always the metallic tang of unspoken resentment. The streets nearest the docks were a perpetual muddy chaos. Here the stout hulls of British merchantmen, painted in the defiant red of the crown, sat like bloated monarchs, heavy with taxed silks, stamped legal papers, and casks of the despised East India Company tea. They were guarded by the trim, unsmiling men of the Royal Navy. Yet weaving among them were the leaner, faster colonial sloops, their owners often men whose fortunes depended on how swiftly they could evade the gaze of a customs officer. It was in this chaotic meeting point of empire and ambition that Elias Thorne spent his life. At 22, his frame was built like the hulls he crafted, broad in the shoulder, weathered by sun and pitch, and fundamentally solid. His ambition was anchored not in politics, but in perfection. He aspired to build the grandest ship the American colonies had ever launched, a true three-masted schooner, perfectly balanced, capable of challenging the speed and majesty of any vessel from the royal yards of England. His work was his sanctuary and his religion. Today, Elias was working on a small, fast cutter for a private merchant, a vessel known locally as the Whisper. He moved with the assured grace of a master, the ad singing a low, resonant note as it peeled a clean curl of oak. His late father, a staunch loyalist, had taught him every precise technique, believing craft and duty were inseparable. Elias, however, separated the two. His loyalty was to the wood, the design, and the flawless execution of his trade. He wanted only to be judged by the quality of his work, a very new world notion of merit that clashed daily with the old world's reliance on inherited rank. His sanctuary was disturbed by the arrival of Commodore Alistair Finch, commander of the formidable British frigate HMS Vindicator, which sat heavily at the main mooring. Finch, an officer in his late 40s, was a man whose starched lace and impeccable uniform seemed to repel the grime of New Haven. He embodied the unyielding authority of the crown. "Thorne!" Finch's voice was a loud, sharp bark that cut through the rhythmic sounds of the yard. "We require immediate repairs to the Vindicator's main spar. A shoddy colonial effort from your competitor, naturally. We sail with the morning tide. Can it be done?" Elias straightened up, his gray eyes steady, but his jaw tightening imperceptibly. "Commodore, a main spar of that size requires 4 days for proper splicing and reinforcement. To attempt a full repair by morning would be to risk the safety of your mast and your crew." Finch stepped closer, tapping his cane sharply on a pile of pine chips. "I did not ask for a lecture on carpentry, Colonial. I asked for a timeline. The king's business does not wait for provincial sensibilities. 3 days, and you will be paid the agreed-upon rate, not a shilling more for your overtime labor." Elias knew the true rate for emergency naval repair, and the Commodore's offer was barely half. It was the constant insult, the assumption of colonial inferiority, that was more grating than the meager pay. "I will begin immediately, Commodore," Elias replied, his voice flat. He looked down at the delicate, balanced frame of the Whisper, a ship meant for speed and liberty, and then at the massive, burdensome spar of the Vindicator. He was a craftsman caught between building freedom and servicing empire. The tension of his choice was a constant knot in his gut. A few winding streets away, far from the physical labor of the docks, the other side of the conflict was being waged with smaller, but perhaps more deadly weapons: words and ink. Amelia Vance was the editor and printer of the New Haven Gazette, a paper that had transformed from a dull record of market prices into a roaring voice of colonial dissent. At 21, she possessed a quick, sharp mind and a quiet resolve that belied her petite frame. Her fingers, usually stained with the permanent residue of black ink, moved quickly and expertly as she locked the type into the chase for the next edition. Her aspiration was simple but profound: truth and enlightenment. She believed the sole bulwark against tyranny was an informed populace. Her loyalty was not to an earthly king or a distant parliament, but to the self-evident rights of man, a concept she disseminated weekly in bold, unflinching editorials that frequently challenged the limits of free speech. The broadside currently on her table was a scorching response to the latest British deployment in the Massachusetts interior, an act she decried as military occupation by a tyrannical hand. Watching her work, his face a study in cautious worry, was Silas Jones. Silas, in his mid-30s, was her chief compositor and pressman. He was a free man, having escaped the suffocating cruelty of a South Carolina rice plantation a decade prior. He carried the deep, wary wisdom of one who knew, not theoretically, but physically, the weight of chains. His loyalty was not yet settled on the colonial cause. He supported their cry for liberty, but his ultimate aspiration was universal freedom, a concept that must, by definition, include men of his own color. He viewed the white colonists' complaints about slavery to the crown with a bitter private irony. "Miss Vance," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly sound, as he proofed the headline. "To call the new governor a petty, uniformed dictator is to invite a closing of our press and an arrest for seditious libel. You tempt the authorities beyond prudence." Amelia did not look up, her focus fixed on adjusting a tiny lead slug. "Prudence is the luxury of those who have already surrendered their freedom, Silas. They call it libel, we call it truth. The moment we cease to publish what is true for fear of the redcoats is the moment we admit they already control our minds, not just our harbors." She finally looked up, her blue eyes intense. "Besides, Silas, the people will read it. They may read it in the dark, under a blanket, but they will read it, and the truth will fester in their hearts until it bursts forth. That is my purpose." Silas sighed, acknowledging her courage, but fearing its cost. "The king's men read it too, Miss Vance, and unlike the people, they have muskets and jails." His experience had taught him that the fervor of white patriots was often quick to abandon a black man when the stakes grew too high. His own freedom felt more like a temporary loan than an inalienable right. He would help Amelia print her truths, but he would also watch his back, for the pursuit of liberty in New Haven was not equal for all. In stark contrast to the raw ambition of the docks and the subversive energy of the print shop was the studied elegance of the town's most fashionable address. the home of Judge Thomas Beaumont and his wife Eleanor. Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont was the undisputed matriarch of New Haven's Tory society. In her mid-30s, she possessed an air of cool, practiced dignity. Her gowns were the finest that could be ordered and paid the tax for from London. Her drawing room was a sanctuary of mahogany, polished silver, and impeccable order. Eleanor's loyalty was a matter of social order and security. She believed in the rigid hierarchy of the British system, which placed her and her husband firmly at its pinnacle in the colonies. The alternative, ruled by unmannered local merchants and uneducated farmers, was unthinkable. Her aspiration was to maintain the peace, quiet, and decorum of the old world in the unruly new. Today, she hosted a small gathering of wives of the highest-ranking colonial officials and British officers. The talk, as always, revolved around London fashion and the distasteful behavior of the colonial rabble. "Did you see the effigy that dreadful mob hung in the town square? Utterly barbaric. They claim to be Englishmen, yet they behave like savages." Eleanor sipped her imported Bohea tea, allowing a thin, tight smile to cross her lips.
"It is this dreadful lack of proper instruction, my dear. These colonists mistake rudeness for rights. If they would simply conduct themselves with proper respect for the established order, they would find the Crown to be a most benevolent father." Eleanor's younger brother, Captain Henry Lathrop, stood near the marble fireplace, his tall, lean figure encased in the pristine uniform of a provincial militia officer, frequently drilling alongside the redcoats. Henry, 25, embodied the principle of duty and honor to the Crown. He genuinely believed that the king's authority was divinely ordained and absolutely necessary to prevent the colonies from descending into self-destructive anarchy. He viewed the Sons of Liberty as nothing more than criminals and smugglers. "It will be handled, Eleanor," Henry stated, his voice carrying the firm conviction of a man who saw the world in black and white. "The governor is requesting additional troops, and several warrants for the most egregious offenders are being drawn up. Once the ringleaders are made an example of, that scurrilous printer among them, this patriotic fever will break. The colonists have grown fat and lazy. They simply need a firm hand to remind them of their place and their immense debt to the mother country." Henry's aspiration was straightforward: to rise through the ranks of the king's service, earning prestige and standing by suppressing this disruptive rebellion. He saw the colonists' push for self-governance as a selfish act of petulant children, ignorant of the grand geopolitical order. He had no patience for Elias Thorne's slow, measured pride in his American craftsmanship, nor for Amelia Vance's inflammatory ink. He was the embodiment of the old world's commitment to hierarchy and control. The fuse of the New Haven tension was lit on a cold, overcast Friday, the day the New Haven Gazette hit the streets. Amelia's editorial was more biting than usual, a direct attack on the newly appointed Customs Commissioner, accusing him of using his office for blatant self-enrichment and abuse of power, a charge that, to many, felt entirely true. The air in the town square grew thick with whispered conversations as the broadsides were passed hand to hand. Silas, after printing the last run, was distributing the papers himself, his face stoic, but his movements quick and aware. He saw the effect of Amelia's words, a subtle stiffening of spines, a shared knowing glance among the dock workers and mechanics. The words were working. Meanwhile, Elias, finishing his forced work on the Vindicator spar, was paid by a junior officer with a curt toss of coins. He knew he had been cheated, but his hands were clean of the mess. He was walking back toward his yard, the setting sun casting a gray pallor over the bay, when he saw the commotion. Captain Henry Lathrop,
mounted on a nervous bay mare, led a detachment of 4 redcoats. They were marching straight toward the Gazette office. Henry held aloft a document with a sweeping official seal, a warrant to seize the press and arrest Amelia Vance on charges of seditious libel. Elias stopped instantly. He was a craftsman. He built things. He had successfully kept the conflict theoretical, a matter of taxes and commerce, not a personal risk. But the sight of Henry, his arrogant former schoolmate, preparing to silence the town's voice, galvanized him. Henry's action was an assault on the very idea of freedom that Elias subconsciously imbued into every ship he built. He strode quickly, cutting through a knot of anxious spectators, reaching the print shop just as Henry was dismounting. "Vance!" Henry's voice was triumphant, ringing with the authority he craved. "By the power vested in me by His Majesty's Governor, I seize this establishment and charge you with the publication of false and seditious libel. You are under arrest." Amelia stepped out, calmly holding a broadside. She looked past Henry to the growing crowd, her eyes wide and compelling. "Read it. Is it false? Is the truth of our oppression a lie?" A low murmur rippled through the onlookers. Henry's face darkened with frustration. "Silence her! Confiscate the press!" As the redcoats moved toward Amelia, Silas instinctively placed his body between them and the delicate, precious machinery. The press was not merely a machine. It was the mechanism of his own freedom and dignity. "Step aside, Negro," one of the redcoats spat, leveling his musket. "This is King's business." Silas stood his ground, his eyes locked on the redcoats, his fear replaced by a cold, burning resolve. "I serve the truth, not the king." At this critical juncture, Elias stepped in. He moved with the quiet power of a man used to lifting heavy, awkward loads, positioning himself right beside Silas, facing Henry. The symbolism was immense. The artisan who valued merit over monarchy, the printer who wielded truth, and the former slave who demanded universal liberty. "Captain Lathrop," Elias said, his voice low, a contrast to Henry's aggressive shout. "You arrest this woman for printing the truth, and this man for his labor. You confiscate the press for fear of the words, but you cannot arrest the hands that built the ships you sail, nor can you silence the thoughts you inspire in the men you oppress." Henry looked at Elias, the shock evident in his face. "Thorne, what madness is this? You are a contractor for the Royal Navy. Stand down, or you forfeit everything. Your loyalty is with the crown." "My loyalty," Elias returned, slowly pulling off his leather apron and dropping it on the dirt, "is with the future, Henry. And the future is not in the king's ships, but in the people who build them." He looked at Amelia, a quick shared acknowledgement of alliance passing between them. The quiet harbor was quiet no more. The first blow of the narrative, the public collision of their loyalties and aspirations, had been struck. Henry, the symbol of rigid old-world authority, faced 3 figures: the artisan, who valued merit over monarchy, the printer, who wielded truth, and the former slave who demanded universal liberty. The revolution for the soul of New Haven, and indeed the entire continent, had begun not with a shot, but with a simple refusal to step aside. The tyranny of the stamp and the press, which will detail the immediate fallout from this confrontation and the escalating conflict between Amelia and Henry. The aftermath of the previous day's confrontation hung over New Haven like the persistent winter fog, thick, cold, and inescapable. Captain Henry Lathrop, thwarted by the unexpected intervention of Elias Thorne, had been forced to withdraw without Amelia Vance. He had seized a small stack of the most recent broadsides, the ones labeling the customs collector an unscrupulous thief. But the press itself, the true weapon, remained untouched. The incident, far from quashing dissent, had solidified it. Amelia Vance was no longer just a zealous young printer. She was a visible symbol of defiance. The print shop was now an indisputable hub of sedition. Inside the New Haven Gazette, the air was charged with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Amelia stood over the press, her expression taut. Elias Thorne, whose defiance had cost him his lucrative British contracts, was now using his massive hands not to shape oak, but to help Silas secure the newly freed machine. "He will return, Master Thorne," Amelia stated, not as a question, but as a prediction. "Henry Lathrop will not abide this public humiliation. He needs that press silenced, and he needs me punished." Elias wiped his ink-stained hands on a rag, a stark contrast to the wood dust he was accustomed to. "He needed a victory to shore up the governor's confidence. You denied him that. Good. But you are right. He won't use the redcoats next time. He will use the law or the bureaucracy. That is the true tyranny of the stamp." The Stamp Act, though partially repealed, remained a bitter, haunting memory. It represented the Crown's ability to demand compliance, not with muskets, but with paper, stamped licenses, mandatory permits, and crippling duties. Henry Lathrop, Elias knew, was a master of leveraging bureaucracy for political suppression. Amelia's eyes gleamed with a combative spirit. "Then we shall print the law as loudly as he attempts to enforce it. Silas, we need a new run, not an editorial this time, but a declaration of rights and grievances. We must shift the narrative from personal attacks to fundamental principles." Silas, meanwhile, was acutely aware of the danger. As a free black man, his presence at the scene had made him doubly vulnerable. The redcoats' disdain for him was palpable. "Miss Vance," Silas cautioned, meticulously distributing the heavy type blocks, "a declaration of rights is fine, but who is signing it? If you put your name on this, you move from agitator to full-blown rebel. And if they seize the press, how do we continue the work?" His fear was valid. The press was their voice, their most vital tool. Elias stepped forward, his shipwright's mind focusing on logistics and defense. "Then we must ensure the press does not fall into their hands. If the printing house is targeted, we need a fallback, a hidden press. I know a dilapidated storage shed near my yard. It's remote, and the tide noise masks most sound." "A clandestine operation," Amelia murmured, a flicker of excitement in her eyes. "Excellent, Master Thorne. You build the hull, and we shall provide the rigging." While the Patriots prepared their defense, Captain Henry Lathrop was indeed tightening his grip on local dissent. He sat in his study, a cold marble room in the family estate, facing his formidable sister, Eleanor Beaumont. "It was an utter disgrace, Henry," Eleanor said, her voice a low, disciplined register of fury. "To allow that shipwright and that woman to make a spectacle of you in the public street. You handed the rabble a rallying cry on a silver platter." Henry paced, his resentment festering. "That damned Thorne! I should have had him arrested for obstruction. And that printer Vance has an unnatural influence on the populace. They cling to her words as if they were scripture." "The words are the poison, and the press is the poison well. You must not attack the press directly again. It only creates martyrs. You must attack the financial and legal foundation upon which they operate. Use the stamp and the paperwork. That is the true civilized English way." Following Eleanor's counsel, Henry devised a methodical plan to choke the Gazette. He mobilized his connections within the Customs House and the Governor's office. First, he ordered the customs inspector to enforce a dormant, little-known provision of the Stamp Acts requiring a special license for the importation of fine rag paper, the only paper suitable for quality printing. All existing stock held by New Haven merchants was to be seized as contraband. Second, he used a loophole in the local militia charter to require all public-facing businesses to obtain a loyalty surety bond, a massive, ruinous sum of money that essentially guaranteed the printer would publish nothing seditious. Henry's intent was clear: to starve the Gazette of paper and to bankrupt Amelia through insurmountable legal fees and bonds. He was attacking the mechanics of the press, not the ideas themselves. The effect was immediate. The paper merchants, fearing Henry's retribution, refused to sell Amelia any of their remaining stock, even at inflated prices. The next day, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived at the print shop with the exorbitant surety bond demand. The crisis sent a shockwave through the hub of sedition. Amelia, Elias, and Silas met around the imposing press, now silent. "They have done it," Amelia said, her voice strained as she reread the official bond demand. "The fee alone is enough to ruin us 10 times over. And the paper, Silas, we are down to just enough for 2 more small runs." Silas, whose experience had taught him resourcefulness, pointed to the remaining half-ream of paper, its texture rough and cheap. "This paper is poor quality, Miss Vance, not suitable for the Gazette. It is made of straw and wood pulp, but it is not imported rag paper. It is local, colonial stock." Amelia immediately understood. "It's coarse, it's thin, the ink will bleed, but it is untaxed and therefore untainted by the Crown's law. We will print the declaration on this. It will be a visual statement, a free press using free paper."
Elias, the man of logistics, addressed the second problem, the bond. The king may demand paper money, but in this town, paper money often means land or property. I still own the rights to my father's original shipbuilding dock, clear of British mortgage. It is worth more than this bond. I will sign it over as the surety. Amelia stared at him. "Elias, that is your entire future, your livelihood." "My livelihood is in my hands, Amelia," he corrected, gesturing to his calloused palms. "That land is just dirt. If the press is silenced, my hands and my future are worthless anyway. We are in this together." The sacrifice was enormous. Elias, the ambitious craftsman, was placing his entire inherited security, his old world standing, on the line for the intangible New World goal of liberty. He officially became the Gazette's underwriter, tying his fate irrevocably to Amelia's defiance. Over the next 2 weeks, the New Haven Gazette transformed. It was printed on the rough, tan straw paper, making it physically different and instantly recognizable. The articles were bolder, and the public saw the paper itself as an act of resistance. Amelia's printing operation became entirely covert. Elias converted his remote storage shed, previously designated for drying rare lumber, into a makeshift press room. In the dead of night, under the cover of the tide noise, Silas, Elias, and a small trusted group of dock workers would move the vital type and the small mobile press components. The secrecy of their operation forced Silas into an even more precarious role. His skin color and his former status as a slave made him inherently suspicious to both the local constables and the British patrols. Yet his exceptional intelligence and quiet demeanor also made him the ideal operative. Silas created a network of communication among the town's free black community and sympathetic dock workers. using coded phrases and prearranged signals to move information and the printed sheets. His personal aspiration for universal freedom fueled his actions. He was fighting not just for the colonists' rights, but for the principle of liberty that might one day redeem his own people. One frigid evening, Silas was delivering a batch of the rough, revolutionary paper through a series of winding alleyways near the docks. He heard the clip-clop of horses and flattened himself into the shadows beneath an abandoned fishing shack. It was Henry Lathrop leading a small, unofficial patrol of militiamen, men whose loyalty was bought by the promise of order and status. Henry was aggressively searching the waterfront, seeking any evidence of the clandestine operation. He was tightening the net of dissent. As Henry stopped his horse directly outside the alley, peering into the shadows, he had a sixth sense for where the trouble festered. Check every vessel. Check every structure, no matter how small. That damned printer is getting her paper from somewhere, and I will find the source. As the militiamen began kicking in the doors of empty sheds, Silas froze. He clutched the bundle of papers beneath his coat, knowing that discovery meant not just jail, but likely being sold back into slavery under some trumped-up charge. He noticed a small, loose panel on the floor of the shack where a boatman once stored bait. He quickly slipped the bundle of broadsides into the space, covering the panel just as Henry's boots scuffed the dirt outside the shack's flimsy door. Henry pushed the door open, his lantern casting a momentary blinding glare. Silas stood still, projecting an image of quiet, harmless obedience. "What are you doing here, Negro?" Henry demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. "Waiting for a fishing boat, Captain," Silas replied calmly, his voice practiced in humility. "Need to earn a shilling for food." Henry studied him intently. His eyes narrowed. He knew Silas was Emilia's pressman. He knew the risk. "You are Jones, the printer's man. You would do well to forget your association with that seditious witch, Jones. The king's mercy does not extend to treason, nor does it distinguish by the color of a man's skin." "Yes, Captain," Silas replied, bowing his head slightly. "I understand the king's law." Henry searched the shack quickly but carelessly, finding nothing. He snorted in disgust and turned away. "Move along, then, and stay away from that press. Consider this a final warning." Silas waited until the sound of the horses had completely vanished. He retrieved the papers, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the realization of how close he had come to the ultimate tyranny. Henry had just confirmed that for Silas, the fight was not just political, but existential. The near seizure of the press forced Elias to work faster on the secret press shed. He labored under the constant strain of fear, using his shipwright's precision to soundproof the small building with layers of pitch and scrap wood, and installing a false floor to hide the printing apparatus when it wasn't in use. His commitment to Emilia's cause was changing his entire life. The local loyalists now shunned him, and he was forced to take smaller, less profitable jobs from colonial merchants. But he found a new sense of purpose that transcended the simple perfection of his craft. He was building the foundation for something larger. One morning, Elias received a formal summons from Judge Beaumont, Henry's brother-in-law. The judge demanded Elias appear at court to provide proof of the financial security of his surrendered dockyard, a clear attempt to legally undermine the surety bond. Elias walked into the courtroom,
usually a place of dry legal decorum, and found Henry Lathrop seated next to the judge with a smug look of anticipated victory. Judge Beaumont, a man whose dignity masked a deep devotion to the crown, spoke with an air of cold authority. Master Thorne, the court has reason to question the true value of the property you have pledged to cover the Gazette's massive loyalty bond. This court suspects that the value is inflated, and therefore the bond is invalid. Elias stepped forward, planting his feet firmly. He was wearing his usual working clothes, a deliberate contrast to the court's finery. Your Honor, Elias's voice was steady. The value of that land, which once held my father's yard, is precisely as assessed by your own county surveyor. But, Your Honor, you miss the point. He looked directly at Henry, who glared back. You believe the tyranny of the stamp and the bond can silence the voice of this town. You believe that by demanding coin, you can command conscience. He pulled a rough, straw paper broadside from his pocket, one of Amelia's recent declarations, and slammed it down on the barrister's table. This piece of paper, Your Honor, is not worth a shilling. It is coarse, it bleeds ink, and it is printed on cheap straw. But it is free. It is free of your tax, free of your regulations, and free of your bond. It is the voice of a free man, printed on free soil, demanding free rights. He pointed at the document. You can seize my dock, you can jail the printer, but you cannot tax the truth, and you cannot seize the memory of what this paper says. That is the true value of the surety, not the land, but the principle. The courtroom, packed with anxious citizens and tense loyalists, stirred at Elias's impassioned defense. Judge Beaumont, visibly shaken by the direct challenge to his authority, struggled to regain control. Henry sprang to his feet, fury contorting his face. Silence! You are committing contempt of court, Thorne. This is not a political rally. It is not a rally, Captain, Elias countered, not backing down. It is a court of law, and yet you sit here as a silent prosecutor, attempting to choke the defense with paperwork and fees. That is the true tyranny. The judge, realizing the growing sympathy of the public in the gallery, hammered his gavel. Order! Order! The court will review the bond documentation. Master Thorne, you are dismissed. Captain Lathrop, you are dismissed. Henry had failed to immediately break the bond. The legal grip had slipped. He had tightened the net of dissent, but the fish had slipped through to a hidden, darker corner of the water. As Elias left the courtroom, he found Amelia waiting outside, her eyes shining with quiet admiration. You spoke with the fervor of a preacher, Elias, she said softly. I spoke with the honesty of a builder, Amelia. You cannot build a durable future on a rotten foundation, and the Crown's foundation here is rotten with corruption and fear. Their resistance was no longer just about printing. It was a shared commitment, Elias providing the security and logistics of the press, Amelia providing the conviction and the words, and Silas providing the vital, dangerous connections to the people. The quiet harbor was now a town divided by a single powerful machine, the press, that Captain Henry Lathrop was desperately and failing to silence. The stage was set for the next inevitable escalation of the conflict. Boston's bloody snow, the unintended martyr. The news arrived in New Haven not by official dispatch, but by a lone mud-splattered rider in the dead of a bleak March night. He brought word of an atrocity in Boston, a confrontation between citizens and His Majesty's soldiers ending in musket fire and bloodshed. 5 colonists lay dead or dying on the cobblestones. The date was March 5th, 1770. The colonists immediately christened it the Boston Massacre. The raw, violent reality of the event ripped through New Haven's careful facade of civic dissent. Until now, the conflict had been a war of words, taxes, and legal maneuvers. Now it was a matter of life and death, an escalation that threw all the main characters' loyalties into brutal relief. The Patriots, grief and galvanization. At the clandestine print shed, Elias, Amelia, and Silas were working by the light of a hooded lantern. The air was thick with pitch and urgency. Elias had just finished reinforcing the false floor to better conceal the press, while Amelia was setting type for an editorial, and piece intended to galvanize support for the defense of Elias's threatened property. The riders' shouted news, relayed by a breathless dock worker, brought their work to an abrupt halt. Elias, always the man of action, felt a cold, deep fury. The Crown had not just taken ships or silenced the press, they had taken lives, he growled, wiping his hand across the rough wood of the press. They fired on unarmed citizens. They have murdered the king's own subjects. Amelia, initially stunned into silence, rallied faster than Elias. Her mind, the engine of the resistance, immediately saw the terrible, potent opportunity in the tragedy. This was no mere protest. It was martyrdom. "We need facts," Amelia commanded, pulling Silas toward the door. "Silas, you must ride to Boston immediately. Get names, get accounts. We need eyewitness testimony, not the governor's fabricated nonsense. We need to print the truth before the Crown can drown it in lies." Silas hesitated. Boston was a hornet's nest of redcoats. For him, a black man riding into that level of military tension, the risk was exponentially higher for Elias or Amelia. Yet the news of the massacre struck him differently. Crispus Attucks, the first man killed, was a mixed-race sailor. Attucks's death was a chilling sign that the Crown's violence did not distinguish by color, and that the promise of liberty, if won, might be a fight for all men. "I will go," Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I will not ride in as a patriot. I will ride in as a man seeking work on a ship. I can hear the rumors the others cannot." Amelia nodded, her eyes acknowledging the deep peril he faced. "Go quickly, Silas, and bring back not just words, but the soul of the event." The Loyalist, duty and dismissal. In the Beaumont home, the news was received with a calculated, cold fury, directed not at the soldiers, but at the colonists. Captain Henry Lathrop was reviewing militia rosters when Eleanor entered, her face pale but composed. "Henry, a messenger from the governor. The rabble in Boston provoked an incident with the 29th Regiment. 5 citizens killed. The propaganda is already spreading like fire." Henry felt a surge of grim satisfaction. "Provoked, precisely. The colonists have grown too accustomed to their license. They assault the sentries, they throw ice and oyster shells, they scream obscenities. The soldiers merely defended themselves against a riot." His loyalty to duty demanded that he dismiss the event as necessary consequence. The colonists were disorderly, therefore they deserved the discipline they received. He saw the dead as casualties of their own insolence. But Eleanor saw the political danger. "Henry, you must be careful. Your sister's reputation is tied to stability. This is not some small scuffle over tea. This is blood. The press, that cursed Vance girl, will use this to paint the Crown as the butchers." "Then we shall paint the deceased as thugs," Henry countered, already drafting a letter to the Loyalist Post, New Haven's rival paper. He was determined to ensure the true narrative, that the soldiers were acting in self-defense against a menacing mob, dominate the local discussion. He was instructed by the government office to immediately increase security around all Crown assets in New Haven, especially the Customs House, fearing a sympathetic riot. Henry felt a renewed purpose. This was a war of order versus chaos, and he was the bulwark of order. His ambition was now to become the man who successfully suppressed the dangerous, bloody anarchy he felt emanating from Boston. The journey and the unintended martyr. Silas rode hard and fast, reaching Boston's South End in the early hours of the following morning. The city was under an eerie, heavy quiet. The snow on King Street, where the massacre occurred, had been partially trampled, but the dark, indelible stains of blood were still visible, a morbid testament to the violence. Silas navigated the city using the routes and codes of the dock workers and free sailors, a community that recognized him as one of their own, regardless of New Haven's distance. He asked about the dead, their lives, and the actions of the soldiers. He learned the names: Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Patrick Carr, Samuel Maverick, and Crispus Attucks. Attucks' name struck a powerful chord in Silas. Attucks was not merely a casualty, he was the embodiment of the painful paradox of colonial liberty. A man of Wampanoag and African descent, he was a runaway slave who died fighting for the white colonists' freedom from tyranny. Silas found a witness, an elderly washerwoman named Martha, who had been in a nearby doorway. Martha's account was stark and emotional. The soldiers had been mercilessly harassed, but the order to fire was sudden and unwarranted. She recounted the fear, the screams, and the sight of Attucks falling first. As Silas took down her testimony, scrawling notes on the back of a customs form he had stolen, he was overcome by a wave of righteous anger. The white colonists spoke of tyranny, but it was Attucks who knew the literal meaning of oppression, who was the first to fall. Silas understood that he must not only report the facts of the massacre, but must ensure the name of Attucks was not buried by the more respectable white victims. His fight was for Attucks' memory, and for the hope that a future America would honor his sacrifice. His journey reached its climax when, near the harbor, he recognized a familiar face, Master Thomas Finch, Elias Thorne's apprentice. Thomas, a gangly, earnest boy of 16, had been sent to Boston by Elias weeks ago to secure a rare shipment of imported nails and fittings, a final necessary order before Elias burned all bridges with the British supply chain. Silas found Thomas huddled in a wharfside tavern, pale and shaken. The boy had been delayed by the customs seizure of his materials, and he had witnessed the massacre from a short distance. "Silas," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear and relief. "It was monstrous. The soldiers, they looked like demons. And the shouting. I tried to help one man. He was bleeding terribly, but the soldiers drove us back." Thomas then revealed the shocking cost of his presence. As a patriot mob had chased the remaining soldiers back to their barracks, Thomas had been caught in the ensuing chaos. A loyalist sympathizer, mistaking Thomas for one of the instigators, had struck him brutally with a trunnion, resulting in a severe, blinding injury to one of his eyes. "It's bad, Silas," Thomas confessed, his hand covering his bandaged eye. "The doctor says the sight is likely gone. I can't go back to Master Thorne like this. I was supposed to be getting fittings for the Whisper. I failed him." Silas gently placed his hand on the boy's uninjured shoulder. "You have not failed, Thomas. You are a witness, and you are a victim. You have paid the price of this tyranny with your sight. Elias needs the truth, not the nails." The irony was stark. Elias's young, innocent apprentice, pursuing a simple commercial errand, was now an unintended martyr, blinded by the violence. The stakes in New Haven had just become devastatingly personal. Silas now carried two burdens: the names of the dead and the responsibility of safely delivering a grievously wounded boy home. The print shop responds. Silas and Thomas arrived back in New Haven 2 days later, smuggled into the town under a tarp in a farmer's cart. Amelia and Elias met them at the secret shed, the moment fraught with emotion. Elias's face went rigid with shock and rage. Upon seeing his apprentice, one eye covered by a thick, blood-stained bandage, the sight of the boy's injury destroyed the last vestiges of Elias's belief that his conflict with the crown could remain purely logistical or political. It was an assault on his own future, on the younger generation he was training. "They did this," he whispered, his large hands clenching into fists. "The king's order did this to a boy pursuing his trade?" Amelia immediately sat with Thomas, gently taking his testimony. The noise, the snow, the screams, the sight of the trunnion. The emotional account was woven with Silas's careful, factual reporting of the dead and the central significance of Crispus Attucks. The resulting edition of the New Haven Gazette was an inferno. Amelia titled it, "Boston's Bloody Snow, a Crime Against Humanity." The front page featured a detailed, horrifying account of the events, but Amelia, guided by Silas, gave Attucks' story prominence, publishing a powerful passage that resonated deeply. The first among the dead was Crispus Attucks, a son of both Africa and this land. His sacrifice reveals the true nature of the crown's tyranny. It strikes down the highest-born subject as easily as the most marginalized sailor. The blood spilt on King Street is a common, binding color, and it calls to us all. If the king's soldiers will murder a runaway slave fighting for our liberties, what hope remains for the free-born colonial? The paper was printed on the rough straw stock, smeared with black ink, and distributed with unprecedented speed. The injury to Thomas, a local boy, lent the story devastating local context. The sight of Thomas being quietly escorted to Elias's yard became a silent, powerful illustration of the crown's brutality. Henry's failed counterstroke. Captain Henry Lathrop watched the immediate impact of the Gazette with mounting horror. The emotional force of the narrative, the dead, the details, and especially the inclusion of the blinded apprentice, Thomas, was overwhelming his carefully crafted counter-narrative of a provoked riot. His sister Eleanor was apoplectic. "They have turned that unfortunate child's injury into a revolutionary banner. You must act. Your official letters and the Loyalist Post are dry and cold compared to the passion of that witch's lies." Henry attempted a decisive counterstroke. He used his authority to organize a public inquiry into the Gazette's funding, aiming to prove that Elias's property was fraudulent and seize the press legally. He also announced a public distribution of the governor's official account of the massacre, planning a grand event in the town square. However, the tide of opinion had turned too swiftly. When Henry arrived at the town square to distribute the official Loyalist pamphlets, he was met not by citizens eager for the official narrative, but by a hostile, silent crowd. As he began to speak of the insolence of the mob and the heroism of the soldiers, hands emerged from the crowd, silently holding aloft the crude, black-stained copies of the New Haven Gazette. The official pamphlets were refused, dropped, or immediately covered with the sight of Amelia's words. Henry found himself shouting into a wall of unyielding collective grief and rage, punctuated by the silent, visible evidence of Thomas's injury. He had failed to control the narrative. The bloody snow of Boston had washed away the last of his credibility. He retreated, his face white with fury, realizing that Elias and Amelia, aided by Silas, had not only evaded his legal tyranny, but had defeated his informational war. The stakes were now irreconcilably high. The American cause had its first official martyrs, and New Haven had its first local casualty, cementing the commitment of its central figures to the long, difficult road ahead. The words had become blood, and the revolution for Elias, Amelia, and Silas was no longer a theoretical pursuit.
The firebrand's conviction, a price on words. The publication detailing the Boston Massacre and the blinding of young Thomas Thorne ignited New Haven. Amelia Vance's words, stained onto the cheap straw paper, became the most powerful force in the colony. The tide of public opinion had turned from wary dissent to open, collective fury. Loyalists found themselves shouted down in taverns and shunned in the marketplace. This shift in mood, however, did not deter Captain Henry Lathrop. It fueled his conviction that only swift, uncompromising force could restore order. The failure of his legal maneuvers and his humiliation in the town square had made the silencing of Amelia Vance his singular, obsessive mission. The warrant and the trap. Within days of the Bloody Snow edition, Henry, working directly with Judge Beaumont, secured what he truly wanted, a new, specific warrant for Amelia's arrest. The charge was no longer sedition or libel, but incitement to riot, a far more serious offense with dire penalties. The warrant was signed and sealed, but Henry, having learned from his previous failures, planned an ambush. He knew arresting Amelia at the print shop would spark a street fight. He ordered his men to intercept Amelia during her morning walk to the print shop, hoping to seize her quietly on a deserted side street before her supporters could gather. But Henry underestimated the vigilance of Silas Jones. Silas, still shaken by his close call and the lessons learned in Boston, had implemented an elaborate surveillance system using New Haven's network of free black men and sympathetic dock workers, men who had every reason to distrust authority. They were his eyes and ears on every street corner. Silas received the coded warning, "The hawk is flying east." He rushed to Elias's yard, finding the shipwright overseeing Thomas's slow recovery. Thomas, still bandaged but defiant, was carefully running his hand over a piece of carved oak, proving his mastery remained despite his injury. "Elias," Silas gasped, his breath ragged. "Captain Lathrop has a warrant. Incitement. They are moving to intercept Amelia on Ferry Lane." Elias felt a cold rush of adrenaline. Henry was aiming at the heart of the resistance. They want to make her an example. If they take her quietly, the fire dies. We cannot let that happen. Elias's choice had been made in the courtroom, but this was the final public affirmation. His loyalty was now wholly to the principles Amelia espoused, and his aspiration was to protect the foundation of this nascent freedom. "We go to the lane," Elias stated, grabbing a heavy, iron-tipped spike, a tool of his trade. "But we do not fight. We surround them. We bring the press to the people." Ferry Lane, the confrontation. Ferry Lane was a narrow, muddy thoroughfare leading from Amelia's boarding house to the bustling north end. It was the perfect ambush point. Amelia, walking briskly toward the print shop, was intercepted by Henry Lathrop and 4 heavily armed redcoats. Henry sat his horse directly across the path, his uniform immaculate, his face set in a mask of rigid duty. "Miss Vance," Henry announced, his voice carrying an icy triumph, "I arrest you in the name of the king for the high crime of incitement to riot. Come quietly, or you will be compelled." Amelia paused, her chin lifted slightly. "I incited only the truth, Captain. If the truth is a riot, then the king's law is a tyrannical lie." As Henry motioned for the redcoats to dismount, a low, rhythmic sound began to approach from the north end of the lane, a heavy, measured thudding. Elias had not ridden alone.
he had rallied 30 of his most loyal dock workers and carpenters, men who revered the shipwright for his honesty and who had been enraged by Thomas's injury. And they were bringing their tool of war. They were literally pulling the printing press, the large, heavy main press that had been kept in the shed, through the mud on a heavy timber sled. It was a massive, cumbersome visual declaration of defiance. Silas walked alongside, flanked by free black sailors, shouting to clear the way. Elias walked at the head of the procession, his presence alone a powerful challenge to Henry's authority. "Captain Lathrop," Elias's voice boomed, carrying over the sounds of the laboring men and the dragging wood. "You want the press? Here it is. We bring it to the public square, and we demand you read the warrant to the people." The crowd of citizens that had been trailing Amelia and Silas surged forward, now energized by the sheer spectacle of the moving press. They were not a mob. They were a determined assembly, shielded by the respectable artisans and workers of New Haven. Henry was caught completely off guard. He had planned a quiet seizure. He now faced a massive, public demonstration centered around the very machine he wanted to destroy. "You are inciting a rebellion, Turn," he yelled, drawing his sidearm. "You call this rebellion, Captain? I call it an open, public demand for redress. Your warrant is for incitement. Prove it. Let the people hear the warrant and judge if they were incited by Amelia's words or by your men's bullets in Boston." The confrontation reached its peak. Henry was flanked by 4 muskets. Elias was shielded by 30 iron tools and the immovable mass of the press. Henry realized that to fire now would be the second massacre, and this time it would be his command, in the full view of his superiors' wives and the press. "Amelia Vance," Henry declared, his voice trembling with frustrated rage, "I release you for now. But I seize this instrument of sedition in the name of the crown." He pointed at the press. Amelia stepped forward defiantly. "You cannot seize what is already in the hands of the people, Captain. We will bring this press to the square, and we will wait for you to try and take it then." Henry, defeated by the weight of public spectacle, spat a command to his redcoats. "Stand down. Send for reinforcements. We will take the press when we can take the whole damned mob." The press in the square, conviction on display. The printing press was hauled directly to the center of New Haven's town square, a place usually reserved for public announcements and market stalls. It was covered with a protective canvas, but its presence was a mute, massive statement. Amelia immediately began to use the moment. She penned a short, powerful broadside titled "The Press is Free," which detailed Henry's failed ambush and challenged the authorities to try and take the press from the assembled citizens. The challenge was clear. The print shop was now an open outdoor forum. The tyranny of the stamp was now the tyranny of the siege. Elias became the undisputed leader of the physical defense. He organized the watch in shifts, using his practical skills to establish security and communication. He was losing all of his loyalist clientele, but he found himself rewarded with something far more valuable: the respect of the mechanics, merchants, and laborers, the true backbone of the colony. His aspiration for perfection had merged with his devotion to the cause of liberty. He was building a nation, not just a ship. His apprentice, Thomas, though blinded in one eye, became a symbol of the cost of freedom. He sat quietly near the press, his very presence an accusation against the crown. For Silas, the press's public position was a mixed blessing. It was protected, but it was also a target. He now spent his nights moving between the press watch and the secretive network he had built, maintaining the lines of communication that kept them ahead of Henry's patrols. His aspiration for universal freedom now hinged entirely on the success of this public defiance. Eleanor's intervention and the political cost. The escalation horrified Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont. Henry's heavy-handed tactics had achieved the opposite of her goal. Instead of restoring order, he had made a martyr of Amelia and a folk hero of Elias. Her prized social order was collapsing into street-level chaos. Eleanor confronted her brother in the privacy of her drawing room, her controlled fury terrifying. "You are an incompetent bully, Henry. You have taken a minor nuisance and turned it into an insurrection," she hissed, dropping a copy of Amelia's latest broadside onto the mahogany table. "Now the citizens see the press as a sacred object. Elias Thorne, that common shipwright, is now the commander of a revolutionary guard. Your violence has given them courage." Henry was defensive. "I was following the law, Eleanor. They are lawbreakers. And now you are a fool. The law, when applied without prudence, breeds contempt. The governor is furious. Your reputation is stained. You must find a way to discredit Thorne and Vance without firing another shot." Eleanor, realizing the futility of Henry's direct force, decided to use the very tools of society to isolate the rebellion. She began organizing a loyalist boycott of all merchants and tradesmen associated with the public defense of the press. This was a direct economic attack aimed at starving Elias and his supporters into submission. The boycott hit hard. Loyalist merchants who controlled much of the town's lucrative trade withdrew their business from Elias's supply lines and from the mechanics who supported the watch. Elias's income plummeted, and he was forced to begin selling some of his father's precious tools to buy food for his apprentice and the watchman. The price of words was now being paid in financial ruin. A public choice and a private pledge. The pressure climaxed during a tense evening shift at the press watch. The air was frigid, and a handful of men surrounding the press huddled close. Elias stood guard, his figure silhouetted against a low-burning brazier. Amelia approached him, her face shadowed by doubt. "Elias, I cannot ask you to continue this. Eleanor's boycott is crippling you. You are losing your yard, your tools, your future. We can move the press back into the shed. The risk is too high for your financial ruin." Elias turned, looking at her with an intensity that went beyond politics. He saw in Amelia the unflinching spirit he respected in a perfectly crafted ship. Resilience, true purpose, and unyielding strength against the storm. "Amelia," he said softly, his deep voice serious, "you gave me a choice when Henry first came for you. You asked me to help build the hull. That hull is not just the press. It is the courage of this town. If I give in to Henry's economic threats, I have admitted that the crown shilling is more powerful than a free man's principle." He reached out, his calloused hands lightly touching the edge of the press's massive iron frame. "My father taught me that a master builder commits every fiber of his being to his creation. I am committing my life to this cause. If I lose my yard, I will build again. But if we lose the press, we lose the foundation of this new nation. That is a price I will not pay." He made a silent internal pledge. His life, his labor, and his future would be dedicated to ensuring Amelia's voice and the voice of liberty would never be silenced. His aspirations were no longer those of a colonial master craftsman, but those of a founding builder of a free republic. Their conversation was interrupted by Silas, slipping through the shadows. He brought grim news. Henry was planning a massive military raid under the guise of an early morning fire inspection. The goal was to surround the square, disperse the crowd, and destroy the press by declaring it a public hazard. "He has learned his lesson," Silas noted. "He won't arrest Amelia in the open. He will destroy the press, silence the words, and then she will have no crime to commit." The battle for the physical press was coming to a head. The price of words was about to be paid not just in shillings, but in bloodshed. Elias looked from Amelia to the huge black mass of the press. They had been given a final warning. They would have to make a choice, either move the press to a final safe location or defend it to the death. The time for words was quickly closing. The Tea Rebellions and the Turning Tide. The year was 1773. The ire ignited by the Boston Massacre had never truly been extinguished. It merely smoldered beneath a thin layer of tense coexistence. Captain Henry Lathrop's attempts to use legal and economic pressure had failed to silence Amelia's press or break Elias's resolve. The press, now a portable symbol of liberty, continued to print, and the citizens, emboldened by Elias's defiance, continued to read. The stalemate was shattered by a new maneuver from London, the Tea Act. This act, designed to save the struggling East India Company, granted it a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies and eliminated the middleman, making the smuggled Dutch tea unprofitable. It was, paradoxically, a way to sell cheaper tea, but the colonists saw it not as a benefit, but as a treacherous bribe. It was a clear attempt to make them swallow the principle of parliamentary taxation. The colonial response was swift and definitive, culminating in the destruction of 342 chests of tea in Boston Harbor in December 1773, an event that would ever be known as the Boston Tea Party. New Haven responded, the tea and the tar. In New Haven, the news of the Boston Tea Party was received with a mixture of elation and apprehension. Elias, Amelia, and Silas understood immediately that this act of destruction was the point of no return. "It is a glorious, defiant act," Amelia exclaimed in the privacy of Elias's shipyard office, her eyes bright with revolutionary fervor. "They have exchanged paper for property. They have traded the tyranny of the tax for the taste of the sea." Elias, however, looked at the action with a shipwright's eye. He saw property destroyed, and he knew the retaliation would be measured, harsh, and economic. "They have destroyed a king's ransom, Amelia. London will not view this as a party. They will view it as an act of war on the Crown's commerce. The harbor will pay the price." Silas, ever the pragmatist, was already organizing. New Haven had received a shipment of the East India Company's tea destined for the local customs house. The Sons of Liberty, inspired by Boston, were planning their own smaller, yet symbolically necessary tea rebellion. "The Loyalists here will claim innocence until they are forced to act," Silas warned. "If New Haven sits silent, the Crown will punish Boston alone. If we act, the cost will be shared and the resistance will be unified." Under the shroud of a moonless January night, Elias, Silas, and Amelia led a small, highly organized group of dock workers and sailors to the customs house wharf. Elias and his men, using their knowledge of rope and tackle, quickly subdued the small guard. Silas and Amelia then oversaw the operation. They did not destroy the tea. Instead, they seized it. They paraded the chests to the town square, opened them, and publicly dumped the tea into a small bonfire, rather than the harbor. The symbolism was powerful. They were burning the tax, not simply washing it away. Amelia stood beside the burning pile, reading a short, impromptu proclamation printed on the spot. "We will not be bribed by cheaper tea, nor governed by tyranny. The flame of liberty burns brighter than the profits of a monopoly."
The Intolerable Acts, the Turning Tide. The British response to the Boston Tea Party and the subsequent smaller tea rebellions like the one in New Haven was precisely what Elias had feared: decisive, punitive, and collective. Parliament passed a series of laws the colonists immediately branded the Intolerable Acts, or coercive acts. The most crippling was the Boston Port Act, which closed Boston Harbor to all commerce,
until the East India Company was reimbursed for the tea. This act was designed to starve the commercial center of the revolution into submission. Other acts restricted colonial governance, protected British officials from local prosecution, and mandated the quartering of British troops in private homes. The impact on New Haven, while not immediate like Boston's, was profound. Boston was New England's lifeblood. Its closure meant the vital circulation of goods and capital ground to a halt. Trade dried up overnight, crippling Elias's remaining business and pushing the town's laborers toward destitution. Economic hardship became the primary weapon of Captain Henry Lathrop and his loyalist sister, Eleanor. Eleanor Beaumont, viewing the intolerable acts as a necessary restoration of order, now orchestrated a massive loyalist relief effort for Boston designed purely to embarrass the Patriots. She raised money from wealthy loyalists in New Haven and surrounding towns, sending provisions to Boston, accompanied by public letters blaming the Patriots for their own suffering. "We send bread to the innocent, while the treasonous authors of this calamity dine on the ruins of their own folly. Let them beg forgiveness from the crown, for their pride has starved their city." Eleanor's objective was to divide the colonial resistance by emphasizing the pain and offering conditional, condescending aid. Her loyalty was to the hierarchical structure, and she saw this as the moment to crush the unwashed rebellion beneath a veneer of civilized charity. Henry Lathrop was granted new authority under the Quartering Act. He was tasked with securing suitable lodging for British troops now being diverted from Boston to other key colonial towns, including New Haven, to maintain order. Henry reveled in the new power. He specifically targeted the homes and businesses of known Sons of Liberty members, intending to use the presence of soldiers as a relentless psychological pressure. His eyes immediately fixed on Elias Thorne's property. "The Quartering Act grants us the right, Henry," Judge Beaumont warned, "but to quarter troops in the home of a respected shipwright who is the surety for the Gazette will only confirm every accusation Amelia Vance has printed." "Let it confirm it," Henry retorted, his gaze hard. "Thorne chose his side when he defended that press. We will choke his business with economic ruin, and we will crush his spirit with the presence of the crown in his very bed. It is time he pays the full price for his insolence." Elias's last stand, the price of principle. The soldiers arrived in New Haven with the cold efficiency of a surgical strike. Henry Lathrop personally led a detachment to Elias's shipyard office and adjacent dwelling. "Thorne," Elias recognized the voice, "by the authority of the Crown and the Quartering Act, your property is deemed suitable quarters for this platoon of His Majesty's Royal Marines. Vacate the premises and prepare to house them." Elias stood his ground, Silas and the recovering Thomas watching from behind him. He had anticipated this. He had lost his contracts, sacrificed his surety, and now they came for his home. His aspiration was to build a free nation, but his immediate loyalty was to protect the few things he had left, his apprentice and the secret press. "Captain Lathrop," Elias said, his voice measured but charged with intense anger, "you may quarter in barracks, taverns, or vacant buildings. My home is neither. It is the residence of a free man, and I have room enough only for my apprentice." "You are obstructing a lawful order," Henry shouted, "and you are committing an unlawful trespass. You seize Boston's commerce, you dissolve our assembly, and now you come for our beds. You confirm every word Amelia Vance has written. You are a tyrant." Elias knew he could not physically prevent the seasoned Marines from entering his house. Instead, he made a calculated final move. He immediately moved his injured apprentice, Thomas, and Silas to the only remaining secure space, the hidden press shed, which was located on the last piece of land not legally covered by the Quartering Act. He then allowed Henry's men into his house, but not before publicly and forcefully removing all his remaining tools and his father's last sentimental pieces of shipbuilding equipment, loading them onto a cart,
and wheeling them away toward the press shed. "Take the house, Henry," Elias declared, staring directly into his old rival's eyes. "But the tools, the mind, and the spirit that builds liberty, those you shall never quarter." Elias's public refusal to surrender his tools and his subsequent voluntary removal from his own home resonated deeply. The people saw not only the cruelty of the crown, but the profound, quiet dignity of a man willing to sacrifice everything but his principles. The birth of unity, a common cause. The intolerable acts, rather than dividing the colonists as intended, had the opposite effect. They forged unified, visceral resistance. The punishment of Boston was seen as a precedent for the punishment of every colony. Amelia's press, now functioning entirely in secret from the camouflage shed, became the voice of colonial unity. She dedicated an entire special edition, printed on the cheap straw paper, to the theme of collective sacrifice. Boston suffers for us all. Her harbor is closed, that ours might be open to the tyranny of the king. New Haven must not send charity to Boston. We must send solidarity. The closing of one harbor is the closing of all. Amelia and Silas organized an immediate, massive intercolonial relief effort rooted in principle, not charity. They arranged for grain, dried meat, and supplies to be smuggled overland to Boston, deliberately bypassing Eleanor's humiliating loyalist supply lines. The solidarity transcended colonial boundaries and social class. Merchants, farmers, and laborers contributed what they could. The Act of Parliament intended to isolate Boston had instead forced the disparate colonies to recognize a common enemy and a common fate. This spirit of unity peaked with the call for a Continental Congress, a meeting of representatives from all colonies to discuss a unified response to the intolerable acts. In the small, crowded confines of the secret press shed, with the sound of the nearby tide masking the rhythmic thump-thump of the press, Elias and Amelia looked at a newly printed call for delegates. "We have done it, Elias," Amelia whispered, exhausted but triumphant. "Henry and his king tried to isolate us, to bankrupt us, to silence us. Instead, they have forced us to unite. The turning tide is upon us." Elias, now essentially homeless, sitting amidst his precious shipbuilding tools and the clandestine press, nodded slowly. "The war of words is ending, Amelia. The Congress will speak, and the king will refuse to listen. The next battle will be fought with iron, not ink."
I must be ready to build the vessels that carry our liberty. His personal sacrifice had cemented his position as a leader. His shipyard was lost, his apprentice injured, and his home occupied. But his tools, his knowledge, and his unyielding commitment now belonged entirely to the unified colonial resistance. The economic hardship had stripped him of material wealth, but had given him a clear, singular purpose, preparing him for the war that everyone now knew was coming. Lexington and the Last March of Peace. The year was 1775. The covert solidarity born from the tea rebellions and the unified resistance to the intolerable acts had given way to an atmosphere of brittle, terrified anticipation. Every whisper carried the potential for chaos. The shadow of imminent war hung over New Haven, palpable and suffocating. In this pressurized atmosphere, Captain Henry Lathrop, having failed to suppress dissent through legal or economic means, was now preparing for the ultimate expression of his loyalty, military deployment. General Thomas Gage, recognizing Henry's intimate knowledge of the colonial interior, had chosen him for a highly sensitive mission. The final deployment, Henry's burden of duty. Henry received his orders at the occupied home of Elias Thorne. The irony was bitter. He was planning to secure the crown's hold on the colonies from the very house of a man now his sworn enemy. His mission was to ride with a detachment of redcoats
from Boston to the towns of Lexington and Concord to seize colonial military stores, powder, cannon, and shot, and to arrest the notorious ringleaders, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. He saw this as his last, best chance to restore order and redeem his standing. His loyalty was absolute, his aspiration to prove himself the decisive soldier the crown needed. The night before his deployment, Henry went to see his sister, Eleanor. She received him in her parlor, the room's elegance now feeling fragile and distant. The march begins before dawn, Eleanor. I ride with Lieutenant Colonel Smith. We will seize the stores and bring those vile traitors, Samuel Adams and Hancock, back in chains. This display of force will end this madness. Eleanor, usually rigid, looked worn down by the constant tension. This is no longer a matter of law, Henry. This is a matter of bullets. If you fire on them, there is no return. You are drawing a line in blood, brother, and I pray you do not step over it. She paused, her expression hardening. And what of Elias Thorne? He is the surety for that press, and he has provided sanctuary for that free black man, Silas. If you secure the traitors, the local rabble will erupt. You must have Thorne arrested before you leave, or he will lead the riot. Henry shook his head. I must focus on the strategic objective. Gage wants the supplies secured and the leaders in chains. I have left warrants with Judge Beaumont. If Thorne raises a hand, he will be instantly arrested and tried for treason. He looked at his sister, his only family, and felt a profound sense of isolation. Pray for me, Eleanor. Pray that my duty is rewarded with a return to peace. Eleanor did not pray for peace. She prayed for Henry's success. May the king's law prevail, Henry. Do not fail us. For if you fail, the world we know here is lost forever. Henry departed New Haven under the cover of darkness, riding the short distance to Boston to join the main column. His heart was a complex mix of fear and determination. He was marching into the history he had desperately tried to defend. The Patriots, the warning. While Henry rode, the Patriots of New Haven were mobilizing. Elias, Amelia, and Silas had established an excellent network of intelligence, maintained through Silas's connections and the solidarity forged during the economic boycott. Word of the Redcoat movement, the gathering of troops, the loading of ammunition, reached the secret press shed near midnight. The message was swift. The regulars are out. Amelia immediately began printing a simple, urgent bulletin. Elias was already out, alerting the New Haven militia leadership. Silas, knowing the importance of the warning and the route the Redcoats would take, felt a desperate urgency. He knew the Redcoats would move fast. He and a trusted network of riders, black, white, and Native American, were tasked with relaying the alarm to the inland towns. "This is it, Elias," Silas said, adjusting the saddle on his horse, his face grim. "If they seize the stores, the resistance is over. If they meet resistance, the war begins. I ride to warn every farm and town on the route." "Go, Silas," Elias commanded. "Ensure every man knows the price of this day. We stay here. New Haven will be Henry's target if he fails. We must defend the press, the town, and Thomas." Silas rode off into the cold, historical night. His aspiration for universal freedom, now riding on the speed of his horse and the accuracy of his warning.
The shots heard round the world. The events of April 19, 1775 unfolded with devastating speed, and Captain Henry Lathrop was right in the middle of the storm. Henry witnessed the first confrontation on Lexington Green. He saw the nervous militiamen, the farmers, the mechanics, the shopkeepers, lined up in defiance. He saw the highly trained redcoats frustrated and exhausted by the night march. The air was thick with tension. Then a shot. No one knew who fired it, a nervous colonial, a trigger-happy redcoat, a spectator. But the sound was a devastating punctuation mark on decades of simmering conflict. Henry saw the redcoats, under the command of a panicked officer, immediately open fire in a full, uncontrolled volley. The raw sound of the muskets, the screams of the dying, and the sight of the scattering militiamen, his own countrymen, shattered his composure. 7 militiamen lay dead on the green. The attack was not the calculated display of force Henry had envisioned. It was a chaotic, bloody mess. His loyalty to duty was momentarily fractured by the awful reality of the violence. He had wanted order, but he had helped unleash murder. The column then moved on to Concord, where they faced a larger organized contingent of colonial militia. The fighting at the Old North Bridge was disciplined and fierce. As the redcoats retreated, the column was besieged by thousands of militiamen and farmers who poured out of the woods and fields, firing from behind stone walls and trees. Henry's deployment turned into a nightmare. His column was transformed into a long, bloody, retreating target. He was forced to watch as men he respected were killed by men he despised. The day was a rout, a humiliating, disastrous failure for the British, and a catastrophic personal failure for Henry. He had marched out to bring peace. He had brought war, and he had lost. Elias's last march of peace. The news of Lexington, that blood had been spilled and the troops were retreating, hit New Haven like a thunderclap. Elias, seeing the chaos and the inevitable arrival of the disgraced and wounded British troops, knew he had to choose his final role. His aspiration to build a free nation now required him to fight for it. His loyalty to the principles of freedom demanded military commitment. He met with Amelia at the press shed. She was frantically printing the first full accounts of the tragedy, now being relayed by Silas's network. "They have started it, Elias." Amelia's voice was strained but resolute. "There is no going back. The people need arms, powder, and leadership now. The words have run their course." "I know," Elias confirmed, looking down at his large, calloused hands. They were the hands of a builder, not a killer, but they were also the hands of a protector. He pulled out his father's last remaining valuable possession, a heavy, ornate, silver-mounted naval telescope. "I will sell this. The money will buy the first shipment of powder we can find, and then I must join the militia." He looked at Amelia, then at Thomas, who was watching from the corner, his good eye fixed on the door. "I will enlist. My experience with naval strategy and logistics can be put to use, but you must stay here. The press is the heart of the resistance. You and Silas are the intelligence, the motivation. If I fight, you must ensure my sacrifice is not in vain." Amelia met his gaze, her fierce conviction softening with worry. "Go, Elias. Fight them with the same courage you showed protecting this press. Your heart is here, and your body must go where it is most needed. We will protect your legacy and your apprentice." Elias made his final, most public decision. He went to the town square, the site of his previous acts of defiance. He stood before the assembled citizens, many of them his neighbors and fellow laborers, and gave his last march of peace. "The king's soldiers have murdered our brothers in Lexington. They came for our powder, but they took our lives. The time of petitioning is over. The time of debate is gone. We must now take up arms and meet their violence with righteous force. I, Elias Thorne, commit myself to the militia, and I ask every free man who values liberty to join me." He immediately presented his petition to the local militia captain. His reputation and public defiance made him an immediate, powerful recruit, the shattered family. The day ended in New Haven with a final, devastating personal scene. The British column, bloodied and defeated, staggered back to Boston, leaving a trail of dead and wounded behind. Captain Henry Lathrop rode in with the remnants of his command, a figure of utter despair and failure. He made one final stop in New Haven, Elena's home. He was covered in mud, his uniform torn, his face streaked with powder and sweat. He was no longer the arrogant officer, he was a broken man. Elena opened the door and gasped at the sight of her brother. "Henry, what has happened? Where is the order? Where are the prisoners?" Henry slumped against the doorframe, the remnants of his duty and honor crumbling around him. "We fired on them. They were simple farmers. We murdered them. And then they surrounded us. They fought like savages. We lost nearly 300 men. I failed. We have started a war we can possibly not control." Elena, despite her shock, tried to regain control of the situation. "You must rest. You must tell the governor that it was the colonialists who fired first. You must control the narrative." Henry shook his head, staring blankly ahead. "The narrative is over. The blood is real. There is no law left to defend. There is only war." It was at that moment that a loyalist servant, terrified, rushed in. "Ma'am, the militia! They are forming up in the square, and Elias Thorne is leading them. They are marching to Boston." The news was the final devastating blow. Elena looked at her defeated brother, who represented the lost cause of the old world, and then thought of Elias, marching to war in defense of the new. The Lathrop family was now irrevocably broken, placed on opposite sides of a nascent civil war. Henry was ordered back to the besieged Boston garrison, his role now defensive and humiliating. Elias, the shipwright, marched out with the New Haven militia, his hammer exchanged for a musket, committing himself to the long, uncertain struggle for American independence. The last march of peace was over.
The Green Mountains Call, a test of brotherhood. The period immediately following the battles of Lexington and Concord was a dizzying whirlwind of righteous fury and desperate organization. Elias Thorne, the master shipwright, was now Private Elias Thorne of the New Haven militia. He had exchanged the ordered, predictable rhythm of the ads for the chaotic, discordant clatter of military life. His commitment was absolute, but the reality of war was immediate and ugly. He was not marching into a revolutionary parade. He was walking into a state of siege. The New England militias had swarmed toward Boston, penning the defeated British garrison within the city. Elias's company was assigned to the northern perimeter, a position that put him directly on the front lines of the burgeoning conflict. The forge of the army, from artisan to private. His transition was difficult. His aspiration for building a free nation had led him here, but his nature was meticulous and precise, traits ill-suited to the militia's current state. The troops were farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers, brave but undisciplined. Supplies were scarce, training was rudimentary, and the chain of command was tenuous. He spent his first weeks building earthworks and trenches rather than ships. Yet, his natural ability to organize, his understanding of logistics, and his imposing physical presence quickly earned him the respect of his comrades and the grudging appreciation of his officers. He used his knowledge of naval construction to reinforce defenses, turning common earth into strong, strategic fortifications. He realized that even here, on the battlefield, he was still a builder. His closest companion was Jonah Pierce, a young farmhand from inland Massachusetts who possessed a buoyant, infectious optimism and an unnerving lack of fear. Jonah, barely 18, saw the war as a great adventure, a grand fight for the glory of liberty. Elias, older and wearier, saw it as a desperate necessity. They were bound by the common cause, but divided by their contrasting perceptions of the struggle. One chilly evening, Elias sat cleaning his borrowed musket. Jonah was nearby, singing a boisterous colonial tune.
"You're quiet, Elias," Jonah observed, grinning. "Worried about the redcoats?" "I'm worried about the mud, the disease, and the lack of powder, Jonah," Elias replied honestly. "I came here to defeat tyranny, not to die of the flux. The redcoats are trained. We are a mob." "We are a people, Elias," Jonah countered, his voice losing his customary lightness. "They fight for a king's pay, we fight for our own land. That's worth more than any training." Elias respected Jonah's simple, powerful loyalty to the cause, but he knew courage alone would not win the war. The call to Ticonderoga, an opportunity. The stagnation of the Boston siege was broken by a bold plan, an assault on the massive, strategic British Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York, situated near the shores of Lake Champlain. Ticonderoga was a key to the continent, holding valuable stores of artillery that the militias desperately needed. Elias's company was chosen to join the expeditionary force under the command of Colonel Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen of the Green Mountain Boys. This ragtag, independent force of frontiersmen and militiamen represented the wildest, most unorthodox edge of the rebellion. The journey north was a grueling test of endurance. They marched through dense forests and over harsh, untamed terrain, relying on the raw toughness of the Green Mountain Boys for guidance. It was here, deep in the wilderness, that Elias's internal conflict, the transition from peaceful citizen to armed combatant, began in earnest. The test of brotherhood. Fort Ticonderoga. The assault on Fort Ticonderoga on May 10, 1775, was less a battle than more a quiet, bizarre seizure. The British garrison was tiny and unprepared. Elias and Jonah were part of the initial wave that slipped into the fort at dawn. The morning mist still clung to the battlements, making the massive stone walls seem ghostly. The element of surprise was complete. Their first true engagement was not with a disciplined line of redcoats, but with a lone British sentry, a young man scarcely older than Jonah, who was startled awake by the sound of boots. The sentry raised his musket, trembling. Colonel Allen roared a challenge, but the sentry was too terrified to comply. Elias saw the sentry's terror, recognized the same fear he had witnessed in the eyes of the British soldiers in New Haven. This was no tyrannical beast. This was a terrified boy, far from home, defending a useless post. The moment stretched, charged with the moral ambiguity of combat. Before Elias could move or speak, Jonah Pierce, propelled by his conviction and youthful recklessness, darted forward. Jonah did not fire. He slammed the butt of his musket into the sentry's head. The force was sickeningly blunt. The sentry crumpled, his musket clattering on the stone. The violence was immediate and primal. The fight for liberty had begun with a cheap, necessary act of brutality. Elias rushed to the sentry, checking his pulse. The man was alive, but badly injured. He looked at Jonah, whose eyes were wide, a strange mix of exhilaration and shock washing over his face. He had fire, Elias," Jonah stammered, his earlier song now a hollow echo. "I had to." "You did what was necessary, Jonah," Elias said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He was grateful the boy had acted, but horrified by the abrupt, ugly initiation into violence. For Elias, the moral ambiguity of combat was immediately apparent. To preserve the higher principle of liberty, they had to commit base acts of personal violence against other young men who were simply following their form of duty. The rest of the fort fell easily. The sleepy garrison was roused from their beds and immediately surrendered. Elias found himself guarding the captured officers, men of rank and refinement, who stared at the colonial militiamen with utter contempt. The contrast between the dirty, ragged, determined Americans and the clean, disdainful British officers was striking.
Chaos of victory. The victory, though vital, was immediately followed by a chaotic struggle for control. Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Boys, a force driven by personal ambition and frontier law, immediately began looting the fort. They were seizing supplies for their own use, not for the Continental Army, creating an immediate fracture within the Patriot ranks. Elias witnessed acts of petty theft and undisciplined behavior that disgusted his ordered nature. He saw men who claimed to be fighting for principle immediately compromise those principles for a pair of boots or a fine coat. Colonel Arnold, the most professional officer present, attempted to impose order, leading to a loud, furious confrontation with Ethan Allen. "Colonel Arnold is right," he yelled, stepping forward to back Arnold against the unruly mob of Green Mountain Boys. "This artillery is for the cause of all the colonies, not for personal gain. We are not thieves, we are soldiers." His shipwright's authority, coupled with his size and clear moral stance, helped Arnold force a fragile truce. The largest and most valuable pieces of artillery were marked for transport to Boston. The fort's massive stores, especially the cannon, were indeed the prize. Elias, looking at the huge bronze King's cannon, realized the profound shift in the war. These weapons of the old world would now be turned against their makers, hauled hundreds of miles by colonial ingenuity. His engineering mind immediately began assessing the impossible task of transporting the heavy ordnance over the primitive winter roads. Betrayal and the test of leadership. The expedition was not without its own internal betrayal. As Elias and Arnold organized the initial movement of supplies, a small contingent of the Green Mountain Boys slipped away, taking with them a captured British officer and a few choice pieces of supplies, intending to sell them for private profit. Elias discovered the theft and the desertion. He recognized the moral choice: pursue the deserters and risk delaying the delivery of the main artillery, or let them go for the sake of the greater goal. Jonah was enraged. "We have to go after them, Elias. That's treason. We cannot let them profit from the cause." Elias sighed, his face heavy with the responsibility of command he was unwittingly assuming. "They have already betrayed the cause, Jonah, but the greatest danger is still in Boston. General Washington needs these cannon. Our loyalty must be to the goal, not to punishing every instance of petty greed." He made the hard, pragmatic decision. He sent a small, quick party to report the treason, but ordered the main effort, the impossible, necessary task of moving the ordnance, to begin immediately. It took weeks of back-breaking, ingenious labor. Elias's practical skills proved invaluable. He designed special sledges, reinforced axles, and organized the precise teams necessary to haul the heavy cannon through the mud and over the rugged mountain passes. He was no longer a shipwright, but a nation builder, using his knowledge of stress, leverage, and structure to move the mountains themselves. The process hardened Elias. The idealism of the New Haven print shop was replaced by the gritty, pragmatic reality of military logistics. He learned that war was less about glory and more about mud, leverage, and the cold calculation of necessary sacrifice. He had to be ruthless with his supplies and relentless with his men. The brotherhood he sought was forged not in shared ideals, but in shared hardship and the monumental task of delivering the weapons that would free the siege of Boston. The personal cost and the end of innocence. Weeks later, after the main artillery had been moved south, Elias finally had a moment to reflect. The fort was secured, the guns were moving, and the Patriots had scored a major victory. He found Jonah sitting alone over the misty lake. The young man was no longer singing. "Jonah," Elias said, sitting beside him, "we won a great victory here." "Did we, Elias?" Jonah's voice was hollow. "I killed a man, that sentry. He didn't even fire at me. I hit him with the butt of my musket. He looked like my cousin David." Jonah's raw, simple aspiration had been tainted by the necessity of violence. He had lost his innocence in the fog of a cheap, necessary blow. Elias understood the feeling perfectly. He had seen the look of utter fear in the young sentry's eyes and felt the disgust at the Green Mountain boy's greed. The moral ambiguity of combat was the true, invisible wound of the campaign. You saved yourself, Jonah, and by saving yourself, you helped secure the guns that will save thousands more. We are fighting for a principle larger than any single life or any single moral choice. War is not clean, and it is not honorable in the act, but if we win, the peace we create will be. He looked back at the captured fort, realizing his own change. He was no longer the man who only built things of wood and iron. He was a man who had participated in the necessary violence to secure the freedom he had only written about. The forge of the revolution was not just heating the cannon, it was tempering the soul of the men who fought for it. He knew that the true test of their brotherhood would come when they delivered the guns to Washington and faced the trained might of the British Army in a real, pitched battle. The victory at Ticonderoga was merely a rehearsal. Under Siege, the struggle for the cradle of liberty. The first shots at Lexington and Concord, followed by Elias Thorne's departure with the militia, transformed New Haven from a hotbed of political dissent into a town under cold, hard military occupation. As the Continental Army settled in for the protracted siege of Boston, the Redcoats needed secure bases for supply and garrison. New Haven, with its deep-water harbor and Loyalist connections, became a secondary military hub. The atmosphere in the town was heavy and toxic. The new troops, deployed under the hated Quartering Act, were a mixture of disciplined regulars and ill-tempered, bored garrison soldiers, quick to anger and quicker to assert their absolute authority. The very visible presence of British uniforms in the town square and the customs house was a constant, grinding psychological pressure on the patriot population. The clandestine heart of the resistance. In the midst of this oppression, Amelia Vance and Silas Jones maintained the fragile, indispensable heartbeat of the rebellion, the free press and the intelligence network. The press itself, Elias's heavy, reliable machine, was deeply hidden in the soundproofed shed near the desolate shipyard. The operation was now entirely nocturnal and terrifyingly slow. The rhythmic thump-thump of the press, once a familiar sound of defiant work, was now the sound of treason that could only be risked during the loudest hours of the tide, a rhythmic noise that only Silas's acute ears could reliably discern. Amelia was the firebrand's conviction now reduced to a whisper. She lived in a constant state of dual existence. Outwardly, a quiet, unremarkable young woman, often seen knitting or tending a small garden. Inwardly, the chief propagandist and morale officer of the colonial cause. Her focus was no longer on grand declarations of rights, but on the daily, necessary battle for morale. Her short, punchy broadsides, printed on rough straw paper, had two key objectives: expose British abuses to incite quiet resentment, and disseminate reliable news from the Continental Army to combat the paralyzing Loyalist rumors of defeat. Silas, meanwhile, was the invisible linchpin. His role in the occupied town was the most dangerous. He moved through New Haven as he always had, a free black man assumed to be apolitical and interested only in labor and survival. This assumption of invisibility was his greatest asset. He used his network of black dock workers, free sailors, and sympathetic servants in Loyalist homes to gather snippets of conversation, troop movements, and supply information. His aspiration for universal freedom now hinged entirely on the success of the colonists in Boston. Every piece of intelligence he gathered was a blow against the very institution of oppression. Under the eye of the hunter, the British command in New Haven, determined to avoid the humiliating failures of Captain Henry Lathrop, appointed a new, far more ruthless officer to secure the area, Major Alistair Finch. Finch was a hard man of absolute military discipline. He did not engage in political rhetoric. He engaged in search and seizure. He immediately realized the town's strange resilience was due to a hidden source of information. He began an organized, terrifying campaign to root out the source of the seditious pamphlets. His campaign focused on the town's marginalized population, believing that fear and desperation would turn informants. He established harsh, arbitrary curfews and conducted random house searches, paying particular attention to the black and mixed-race communities, assuming they held no loyalty to the white rebels and could be easily intimidated. Silas found himself under intense personal scrutiny. His known association with the Sons of Liberty was history. His current status required him to be flawless. One afternoon, Major Finch intercepted Silas on the main street, where Silas was working as a simple carter, moving firewood for a loyalist magistrate. "You are Jones, the former pressman," Finch stated, his voice flat and dangerous. "Yes, Major. I follow the magistrate's orders now," Silas replied, bowing slightly, performing the practiced humility that was often required for survival. "I find your presence here remarkable, Jones. A man who worked for rebellion now works for loyalty. I find it hard to believe you have no memory where that seditious press is hidden." "I only remember the work, Major. The Master Thorn took his own counsel when he left. I know nothing of his secret movements." Finch's eyes were cold and discerning. "Listen closely, Jones. We know the ink is drying on the pages that mock His Majesty. We know you are the fastest messenger in this town. You bring me the press, and you earn your freedom and a reward. You keep silent, and I will have you tried under the Articles of War for complicity. Loyalty or rope, choose now." Silas stood tall, his heart pounding, his loyalty to the cause unshakable. "I chose work, Major. I am a free man doing honest labor. That is all." Finch let him go, but the encounter was a clear, terrible warning. The noose was tightening. The messenger's run, a test of invisibility. The peril peaked when vital intelligence arrived from Boston. A trusted source within the besieged city relayed a critical piece of information. General William Howe was planning a major surprise feint across the Charles River to draw American forces away from a potential strategic high ground, Dorchester Heights. The information was crucial. If the Americans left Dorchester Heights unguarded, the siege would be prolonged, perhaps lost. Silas had to get this information to the commander of the New Haven militia, who could relay it to Washington's lines. But Major Finch had placed triple patrols on the known routes out of town. Amelia prepared the message. 2 small sheets of the thin, rough printing paper, compressed and covered in beeswax, sewn into the lining of Silas's coat. "The risk is too high, Silas," she whispered, her hands shaking slightly as she worked the needle. "If they find it, the information will already be gone," Silas countered grimly. "I will not take the roads. I will take the marsh." Silas knew the local tides and the hidden mudflats that ran along the estuary, leading toward the American lines. He chose the hour of the low tide, forcing himself to move through the thick, sucking mud and tall reeds, terrain no British officer would willingly risk. It was a grueling, agonizing journey. The mud pulled at his boots. The freezing March water soaked his clothing, and the reeds snagged at his coat. Halfway through the desolate expanse, he heard the baying of Major Finch's hounds. The officer was pursuing him, sensing the high-stakes risk of the hour. Silas, moving with the silent, desperate skill he had honed in the southern wilderness, managed to ditch the hounds by wading into the deeper, freezing channel of the estuary. The cold was unbearable, but the water masked his scent. He emerged hours later, near dawn, on the other bank, exhausted, hypothermic, but alive. He delivered the intelligence to the American post, coughing out the words before collapsing into the care of the militia. The intelligence was accurate and immediately relayed to General Washington. The paper war and the crisis of confidence. While Silas was risking his life on the marsh, Amelia faced her own crisis in the occupied town. The British successfully infiltrated and planted a rumor in the market square that a major outbreak of smallpox had ravaged the Continental Army, and that General Washington was preparing to disband the siege in defeat.
The rumor struck a nerve. New Haven was immediately plunged into a crisis of confidence. People began to fear the occupying troops less than they feared the sickness and the apparent inevitability of British victory. Amelia knew she had to print a refutation immediately, but the press was dangerously silent, awaiting Silas's return. She was left alone with Thomas, the apprentice, whose remaining eye was fixed on her with silent, worried devotion. "I cannot wait for Silas," Amelia declared, her mind racing. "The rumor is too potent. If the people lose faith in Washington, we have lost the war of words entirely." She chose to risk the small portable press, a hand-operated traveling press that Elias Thorne had built for covert field use. It was loud, awkward, and could only print half a sheet at a time, but it was fast. She worked in the dead of the day, sealing the shed, forcing Thomas to crank the heavy screw. Her defiance was fueled by sheer necessity. The resulting pamphlet, printed in a tiny, defiant run, was titled "The Lie of the Pestilence." It was a direct, emotional appeal challenging the citizens to trust their sons and neighbors over the word of the king's demoralized army. They fear the smallpox, but they fear the truth more. Your sons do not run from sickness, they stand fast against tyranny. This lie is not medicine, it is poison to your hearts. Let your faith in liberty be the true antidote. The cause stands and the press is free. She entrusted the few printed sheets to the network of local women, seamstresses, bakers, and washerwomen, who, like Silas, were assumed to be harmless. They distributed the pamphlets in their laundry baskets and bread deliveries, neutralizing the smallpox rumor within hours. Amelia's calculated risk, betting on the strength of colonial fellowship, had paid off. The guns of deliverance. The climax of the siege arrived on the morning of March 4th, 1776. Major Finch, confident in his security measures, was reviewing his command when a nervous sentry pointed toward the southern horizon. The sight was impossible. Dorchester Heights, the crucial, undefended hill overlooking Boston and the harbor, was suddenly bristling with cannon. They had appeared, seemingly overnight, placed with a masterful precision that spoke of powerful engineering and relentless labor. These were the heavy King's cannon from Ticonderoga, hauled over mountains by Elias Thorne and his desperate crew. The arrival of the artillery was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. Elias's engineering feat, combined with the intelligence that Silas had delivered, made the British position in Boston instantly untenable. The guns were placed perfectly to either destroy the city or sink any ship attempting to evacuate. In New Haven, the sound of the artillery fire from the heights was muffled by the distance, but the effect was immediate. Major Finch's face went rigid with rage and disbelief. The garrison instantly began frantic preparations for a full evacuation. In the press shed, Amelia and Silas, finally reunited and warm, heard the news of the Dorchester Heights victory. It was the ultimate vindication of their grueling, dangerous work. Elias's hammer had been heard, and their ink had been vindicated. "They are leaving, Amelia," Silas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The tyranny is broken." Amelia looked at the press, its heavy iron frame silent and powerful. "The physical tyranny is broken, Silas. Now the real work begins. We must tell the story of the sacrifice. We must ensure that the free world we are building is worthy of the men who hauled those guns and the men who risked their lives to carry the words." The British evacuation of Boston marked the end of the first, desperate phase of the war. New Haven was liberated, but the war was far from over. Elias was now a field officer, dedicated to the Continental Army's broader fight. Amelia and Silas were left with a crucial new task: to secure their press and prepare the hearts and minds of the people for the Declaration of Independence that was now inevitable. Their struggle under siege was over. The struggle to define a nation was just beginning. The Crossing, a winter of disguise. The year was now 1776, closing into 1777. The euphoria of the British evacuation from Boston had long faded, replaced by the grim realities of a losing war. General Washington's Continental Army had suffered humiliating defeats in New York and had been forced into a desperate retreat across New Jersey. The capital, Philadelphia, now felt dangerously exposed. Amid this deep winter crisis, the primary need of the Continental Army was not just soldiers, but intelligence. The British forces, led by General William Howe, had settled into comfortable winter quarters in New York and Trenton, their movements unpredictable, their intentions opaque. Washington needed to know their disposition, their morale, and crucially, their defensive weaknesses before the enlistments for the year expired. It was a task for which Silas Jones was uniquely suited. His experience as a former slave, a skilled pressman, and a master of clandestine communication made him the ideal agent. He had the ability to move through occupied territory unseen, relying on the British presumption of his harmlessness, a form of invisibility that no white officer could ever achieve. The mission briefing was a necessary risk. Silas met with Elias Thorne, now a major in the Continental Army, detached from his artillery duties to assist with engineering and intelligence logistics. Elias, hardened by the Ticonderoga campaign and the subsequent retreats, understood the extreme danger of the task. "The intelligence from New York has dried up, Silas," Elias explained, tracing the British lines on a rough map. "Howe has New York locked down. We need to know the strength of the garrisons in both New York and Trenton, particularly the movements of the Hessian mercenaries. They are fighting for pay, not principle. They have weaknesses we must exploit." Silas's loyalty to the Patriot cause was absolute, but his aspiration for universal freedom gave his mission a profound, dual purpose. He knew that the Hessian forces, often reliant on forced colonial labor, held many enslaved and indentured people. Gathering intelligence was his primary duty, but aiding those in bondage was his personal mission. "I will go as a free carter, Major," Silas confirmed, his voice steady. "My papers are in order and my trade is legitimate, carrying supplies between farms. My skin allows me into places the redcoats will never suspect, and my ears will hear the whispers the officers dismiss." Elias handed him a small, heavy parcel wrapped in oiled cloth. "The river is freezing, Silas. You must cross tonight before the ice fully sets. Use the money to buy your way past any minor patrol.
If you were caught by a major officer, memorize this: destroy the papers. The separation was weighted by the acknowledgement that this mission was exponentially more dangerous than any Amelia had faced. Silas was crossing into the heart of the enemy, and if captured, his former status could easily be rediscovered, ending his freedom forever.
That is where the true spirit of A Saga of American Destiny Part 1 rests. Not in grand feasts or legends, but in the quiet grace of gratitude itself. And as we close tonight's story, I want to thank you for being here, for listening, and for keeping these histories alive. If you've enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribe, like, comment, and share, where we continue to explore the stories, traditions, and mysteries behind the celebrations that shape our world. Your support helps keep the lantern burning, illuminating the past so that its warmth can reach the present. Until next time, may your nights be peaceful, your hearths bright, and your heart filled with gratitude. And I pray for your success and abundance. Good night and happy holidays.